Hey everybody, James here from Long Live Geek, and today I wanted to talk about something that's been kind of rummaging around in my mind over the last couple days, which is this concept of them retconning the sequel trilogy. And even though I made it very clear in the last video I did kind of talking about this that I don't think it's going to happen, and I still don't, just the thought exercise of it is kind of intriguing. So I'm going to do this, and I'm going to kind of set kind of the basic ground rules for how I think it could happen. And if this video does well, and if I get a lot of good comments on it, I might expand upon that, especially if I have time and my thoughts evolve on this a little bit more. But anyways, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Like the video, that really helps with the algorithms. And anyways, let's get this going. First of all, the entire concept of them retconning the sequel trilogy actually comes through the world between worlds that we saw in Star Wars Rebels, and Palpatine being able to access that. In particular, in some ways, the way I understand it is that there's a set of mirrors on the Death Star, and there's a set of mirrors on Exegol, and him being able to transport himself between those two places. Now, with this, that's kind of interesting in and of itself. I mean, we saw the mirrors on Rise of Skywalker that Rey ran into when she was on the Death Star, and so there's some reason to think that maybe the mirrors do play a role. And that maybe that dark self of her that she saw was actually a different version of her in a different timeline. That kind of intrigues me, even though I'm not a huge fan of going the alternate timeline route, because then when does it end? Do we ever take a death seriously within Star Wars? And you have all those kind of questions. But this premise that really intrigues me is that when Palpatine is thrown down the shaft, that he doesn't have access directly to those mirrors to be able to transport himself to Exegol, but he's able to, before he dies, he's able to let his Sith spirit out of his body, and that Sith spirit is able to travel between the world between worlds and into Exegol, where he, at that time, already had planned, just in case if he died, he already had cloning facilities and stuff like that, and he was able to put himself into another body, and he's like, alright, I better stay here and kind of plot the next however many years until I'm able to get back in power with the galaxy. In this theory that I'm kind of trying to run with, Ezra himself, who has access to the World Between Worlds, or could possibly get access to the World Between Worlds, stops this from happening. He's able to keep Palpatine's spirit from getting to those mirrors, or however he transported to Exegol, therefore condemning Palpatine's spirit, and he never comes back. Now, this would obviously completely reset most of everything. There's no Palpatine behind the scenes to create Snoke. There's no Ben Solo falling to the dark side, and a lot of the other stuff, the First Order probably doesn't happen. So in other words, the sequel trilogy just never happens. And I think even though it's kind of assumed that Rey would never be born, I'm not quite ready to run with that. I need to do more research. Let me know in the comments if you think that Rey would just never be born if this didn't happen. I want to think that the clone of him that was the father of Rey could possibly already be out there. Maybe Palpatine already was messing around with cloning before Return of the Jedi. So, in this world where Palpatine never gets to Exegol, a lot of the other things don't happen. So now I want to talk about how the stuff that they're doing within the Mandalorian and the possibilities of them having spin-offs, and this being kind of the new era that they build from, could play into this. And if they were, first of all, they're not going to, if they were to retcon this and say that none of this stuff ever happened, they're not jumping directly to that era. They're not going to the sequel era and redoing 7, 8, and 9. They're not doing that. But they have an avenue to build back towards that time period with The Mandalorian, the supposed Ahsoka show, the Boba Fett show, the Ezra and Thrawn show, and all these other things that could build us back to the sequel era time period. Well, this is where I think it could be interesting, because this would give us an opportunity, and I know nobody wants to see Luke and Leia get recast, but they are two of the most iconic characters in all of fiction, and you can't tell me we are never going to see them live action again. I just don't buy it. I think at some point we see them live action. So we already have a different Han Solo, and I think that Han could come into this. I can't even remember the name of the actor that plays him. I don't think I could pronounce. I was never been able to pronounce it anyways. Who cares? But that version, the younger version of Han, I think within the Mandalorian time period, he could play Han in that time period and be completely fine. So we have our Han. Sebastian Stan has been, there's been little bits and pieces of rumors of him possibly one day playing a younger Luke. And even though I think for this time period Sebastian Stan might be slightly older, I still think that he can make it work. And then Leia, obviously if they went with her daughter, Billie Lourd, I just don't know how good of an actress she is, so I would be open for her possibly getting that role, but I do think that there's a good chance that they would find somebody else out there. I think that within 3 series that they could come up with in this Mandalorian era, that they could find a really good spot to introduce all 3 of those characters, but not at the same time. I wouldn't want one episode of like The Mandalorian where we see Luke, Leia, and Han. I would want to see them have them in separate shows show up, these different versions of them. And I think we have perfect ones for that. First of all, Boba Fett. I think the Boba Fett show could be where we show Han. In particular, if Boba Fett decides to go for revenge against Han, and so then we see the younger version of Han in there, and Boba Fett actually makes peace with them. They come to terms with what happened in the situation, because I think they're going to take Boba Fett within the Mandalorian series and have him kind of on that edge between whether he's good or bad. And I think that there's going to be an opportunity for him to become a legitimate Mandalorian. And within that, I think there's some things in his past he's going to have to let go. So I think you introduce Han in the Boba Fett series. Luke, you introduce in the Ahsoka series. To me, that makes the most sense. I think that at some point, Ahsoka has to find out what happened to Anakin. And I think meeting Luke, I think that first of all, I think Luke would somehow find out that Anakin had a apprentice. And I think at that point, he would have access to information and know that she's still alive. And he would seek her out, especially knowing that she worked for the rebellion. Or Ahsoka could be looking for this Skywalker, this Luke Skywalker she found out about, and probably assume that it's Anakin's child, or maybe the galaxy already knows that this is this Anakin Skywalker from a long time ago, who is this great Jedi general, and Luke Skywalker is his son, and she could seek him out. And this would be an emotionally great scene between Ahsoka and Luke, especially when Ahsoka finds out that Anakin turned back to the light before he died. I think that would just be absolutely phenomenal. And Leia, I think, would work best to be reintroduced in The Mandalorian. In particular because Cara Dune went AWOL with the rebellion. So technically, could possibly be hunted down by the Republic. And they could be looking for her to stand trial. And I think it would be awesome that if Cara Dune does something to redeem herself, and have Leia actually pardon her for going AWOL. And I think that would be an absolutely amazing scene. So I think we have opportunities for all 3 of those characters to get reintroduced, and then for us within these shows in small snippets to be able to get accustomed to these new actors playing them, and eventually down the line for us to be able to have another movie, or however we do it, with those 3 getting back together within their own thing. Now even then, we have the Ezra and Thrawn show, which could particularly be where we actually see everything getting reset. Ezra could access the world between worlds at some point, see the future, and see that Palpatine survives, see the final battle on Exegol, see all of this, the First Order and everything that they did, and he could go back to that moment when Palpatine is about to go through the mirrors, his spirit, and go to Exegol to save himself, and maybe Ezra destroys the mirrors in Exegol, or destroys the mirrors on the Death Star, or finds some way of stopping that from happening. And I think if they were to go this route, I think at some point they don't announce that the sequel trilogy is being retconned at any point. It just naturally happens within one of the series, and we're like, oh crap, None of that's going to happen now because Ezra stopped Palpatine from being able to be saved after Return of the Jedi. Now, last thing I have on this is the possibility of Jason and Jaina Solo being introduced within Star Wars canon. If you don't know already, Jason and Jaina Solo are the twins of Han and Leia, and Jason eventually becomes a Sith and has to be killed by his twin sister. I love the story. I know there's a lot of people that weren't big fans of the New Jedi Order, but even those people seem to like those two characters. So first of all, I think that would be awesome. It would mean that we wouldn't get Ben Solo, but Ben Solo and Jason Solo are similar enough that I don't think it really matters. So the biggest problem I have with this theory is, how does that happen? What are going to be the changes that happen within this new timeline that make it so that they don't conceive a child at the same exact time and that child becomes Ben Solo? I'd be interested to see if anybody out there has any ideas of what could change. I mean, I think in some ways it would require for either Jason and Jaina Solo to be born later, maybe even Leia's pregnant with them at the time that she appears in one of these series, or much earlier, maybe a couple years earlier, and at that point these children would be 6 or 7 years old at the time in The Mandalorian, and we could actually see them cast. But I still haven't really figured out why Palpatine not surviving would change the timeline of when they had a child, because that's what would have to happen for them to instead have twins instead of having Ben Solo. But anyways, those are the things that have been kind of floating around in my mind. I want to put a little bit more thought into this. This is kind of the first one of these. I want to do more as I evolve my thoughts on how this can happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think they're going to retcon and they're basically going to say these other films didn't happen. I don't think they're going to go with alternate timelines because I think they want deaths to stick, even though technically we've already seen 2 deaths that didn't last in Maul and Palpatine. But I think it's important at some point that when somebody dies, you can be like, oh, to feel sad about it and know that it's going to stay that way. But I'm intrigued by the opportunities that they have to make this happen. I do think that using the Mandalorian time period and the shows that might spin off on that would be the best route to go. But let me know in the comments what you think. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. And as always, may the Force be with you.